Brilliant, thanks. Good evening, all. Sorry we're slightly delayed, but we're together now. Hi, I'm Margaret O'Callaghan. I'm acting director of the Institute in Peter Gray's absence and occasional presence. So it's a great honour to be here today and to introduce one of Ireland's most distinguished labour historians, Emmet O'Connor, to speak to us on the topic of his really interesting looking new book entitled Rotten Prod, The Unlikely Career of Dongaree Baird. This is a study of Baird, a boilermaker in Harland and Wolff's, one of the hundreds of so-called rotten prods and thousands one of those and thousands of Catholics, all of whom were driven from their place of work by loyalists in 1922. The expulsion could be said to mark the end of Belfast's 2 red years, distinguished by the massive engineering strike in 1919 and the radical municipal elections of 1920, in which Baird was elected to Belfast Corporation. So today, Emmet, who has gone into Baird's complex and multi-locational career and retrieved a lot that we knew nothing about, is here to give us a talk on Rotten Prod, The Unlikely Career of Dongaree Baird. The book's published by UCD Press. I won't go through an exhaustive list of Emmet's publications, but I will mention one of his other books with UCD Press with Barry McLaughlin, In Spanish Trenches, The Mind and Deeds of the Irish Who Fought for the Republic in the Spanish Civil War. And that was UCD Press 2020. So this is UCD Press. I commend it to all, and we're delighted to have Emmet here to speak to us today. Thanks so much.
Sorry. Right, well, thank you all very much for the invitation, and thanks to you all for coming along. This is me. If you want to contact me, the best way is through email. Sorry, I have a... Right. So why a biography of Baird? Well, not because he was a rotten prod. He has been cited in some of the literature as a kind of an icon of anti-unionism. And I picked him because he was a labour activist who was confronted with these problems of disputed nationalities and territory and so on. And which has been written on Belfast labour since the 1970s. But I think the bulk of it has been written from an anti-unionist or an anti-nationalist perspective. And I want to try and write it from a labour perspective and just see what it was like for a labour activist. And we've come across Baird since the 1970s when I spoke to some veterans of the 1923 farm strike who remembered him. And he kind of flickered in and out of my attention and the books. And there are bits and pieces written on him in the literature on books on Belfast labour between 1917 and 1921. But it was always kind of just a name, just a passing reference. And I was curious to see whether much more could be discovered about him. So that's really why I wanted to look at him, because he was sort of a labour activist, and I wanted to see what the response of the labour activists was. So the themes in this talk, I want to look at Baird himself and how representative he was of the religious bloc, of the class that he came from, fellow workers in Harland and Wolff, and of the trade union movement. And then what did the rotten prods tell us about labour in Belfast, in Ireland, and also in the British labour movement? So briefly, Baird's biography. He was born in 1871 in Clogher. His father farmed about 10 acres, so he would have been a very small land owner. He was a tenant farmer. He died about a year after James was born, and his mother remarried a farmer of about 24 acres and had 8 more children. James had one full brother, and then he had these half siblings. But we know very, very little about his upbringing, and I was always searching for personal information because I desperately wanted to put, colour on the name and a face on the name, because so often Belfast Labour has just been looked on in a very impersonal way, just as forces illustrative of anti-unionism or anti-nationalism, and I wanted to kind of flesh out as much as possible the experience of an individual, and found it very difficult to do because, of course, most of us don't leave much of an imprint on history. When I was writing about Jim Larkin, he was such a big man in every respect, and constantly in the newspapers and so on. I could tell you what he was thinking at any given year. It was so easy to get into his mind. With Baird, it was much more difficult. So he probably joined Harlan Wolff about 1893. He talks about being a socialist and a home ruler on Queen's Island from 1893. And then normally apprentices served a 5-year apprenticeship before being fully admitted to the union, the United Society of Boilermakers. So possibly it was about that time. And it would have been, you kind of wonder how somebody from such a poor background became an apprentice tradesman in what was called the Black Squad, the riveters and caulkers and so on, who did the sort of heavy kind of metal work in the shipyard. But Harlan Wolff would have been expanding at that time and getting into marine engineering, which would have been the final stage in the Industrial Revolution of Belfast, which had begun, I suppose, in the late 1820s or 1830s. And before that, Harlan Wolff would have built ships, and then they would have bought in the engines and then fitted the engines into the ships. But from the 1890s, they're starting to make their own engines. So this would have been high value-added work. So it's possible that there was a sort of a shortage of potential skilled workers at that point, and he was able to get in, because usually the jobs were more or less passed on from father to son. In that, if your father was an apprentice, the fee was a lot lower for getting entry into the trade, and this way the jobs were kind of kept within the family tradition. But in 1898, he married Frances Lavinia Miller. She was the daughter of a head constable in the RIC who retired very soon afterwards, and she'd been born in Tipperary. Now, she was only 18 years old at the time, and the name, the occupation given for her on the certificate was simply spinster. So, but when the book was in print, frustratingly, just after it went into print, the family of Baird made contact with me, and they said that she'd been married before, but her husband died shortly afterwards in a riding accident. So I don't know, but there's no evidence of that. Maybe it's just a family tradition. I'm not sure anyway. She was very young. He was about 10 years older. So they had 6 children, 5 girls and one boy. So this is a picture that was sent to me from his granddaughter, or his granddaughter, Victoria Jeremejenko. She married a Ukrainian, hence the surname, who's now living in Brisbane in Australia. And I think that, judging from the ages of the youngest child, I think that that picture would have been taken about 1922. But as I say, personal information on him is very, very scant. But he comes across quite a respectable sort of figure, with the 3-piece suit and the watch chain, as well as, curiously, the bow tie. And then on the far right, then we have his wife, Frances. The 2 eldest girls became famous pianists and were decorated by the Australian government for their services to music in schools. So this girl here with the ribbons, Kathleen, is the mother of Victoria Jeremejenko. So the influences on him, obviously his tenant farmer background, the fact that he does seem to have identified very much with the poor rather than with the sort of fellow elites within the iron making trade. He certainly retained this affinity with the land, and his only son went on to become a farmer. He remained a Presbyterian throughout his life. Not quite sure how seriously he took it, but there are some indications that, where he talks about Presbyterian values, and he was a Rechabite. Now, this was one of the friendly societies, independent orders that sprang up in Britain, mainly in the 19th century, before the coming of the welfare state. And the Rechabites were associated in particular with teetotalism. And Baird himself, of course, was a teetotaler. But they would have also been associated pretty much with the Liberal Party in England. There were 26 Rechabites MPs elected to Westminster in 1906, and 23 were Liberals. 2 were Labourites, and 1 was Todd Sloan, who was the independent unionist elected for South Belfast, this area here, having sort of broken away from the main unionist party. And Sloan was he was a kind of prototype of loyalism, in that he combined this kind of rough, vague kind of radicalism, this antagonism to the Fur Coat Brigade, with this trenchant unionism and loyalism, and then try to merge the two, and then try to deal with the contradictions in that as well. So the Rechabites also had a reputation for being strong on women's rights and suffragism, and that there's no kind of hard evidence of that, but it does sort of vaguely come across in Baird that, with 5 daughters, and he was concerned about their welfare and progress and so on. And they seem to have been a very close and loving family. There are 1 or 2 indications from his eldest daughter, Nora, that, growing up in Belfast, was a very happy time for her. And she always remembers there was music in the house, and that her mother would sing. She went on to become a distinguished pianist and piano teacher. So obviously trade unionism and socialism became very important to him. And how much of a nationalist was he? Well, he felt very Irish, but then, everybody did at that time before partition. Unionists would have had no problem calling themselves Irish. Of course, they meant it in a different way to the way that nationalists would have described themselves. So to what extent was Baird a nationalist? Again, it's very hard to say, but certainly he was very anti-partitionist by the early 1920s, and he kind of turned to republicanism as a way of opposing partition, because he believed that partition would institutionalize the sectarian divisions in the northern working class. Now, that was the kind of standard position on the left at that time. James Connolly's remark that partition would lead to a carnival of reactions, much quoted as if it was a kind of unique prophetic insight. But Connolly was just reflecting the standard view of the labour movement at that time. So he joined the United Society of Boilermakers, as I think he more or less had to, but he soon became branch secretary, and then he became active in Belfast Trades Council from 1903. So 1903 was an important year, because it was in that year that William Walker, who had been the best known labour figure at the time and had been a joiner in Harland and Wolff, persuaded the Belfast Trades Council to abandon its sort of local labourism and form a branch of the Labour Representation Committee. So Labour in Britain generally, traditionally supported the Liberal Party. The Liberals were the party of Labour. But from the late 1880s, there were growing demands for Labour to have its own party. And this presented a problem for Belfast Labour, because on the one hand, it looked to British Labour as its role model and wanted to go with British Labour. On the other hand, the mass of workers were unionist, and they looked on the Liberals as being too sympathetic to Irish nationalism. Even before Gladstone took up the Home Rule question, they regarded the Liberals as being a bit soft on Irish nationalism. So in politics, they would have been more conservative. The kind of key contradiction in Belfast Labour was not the religious divide between Catholics and Protestants, because Catholics were kind of marginal to the craft unions and therefore marginal to the trade union movement. So the key division was really the difference between Labour with a capital L, the official labour movement, and Labour with a small l, those who worked. So Labour with a capital L was pro-liberal, because that's the way its role model, the British Labour movement, was going. And Labour with a small l was largely pro-Tory, because the Tories were seen as more reliable on the national question. But William Walker, who as I say, had been a joiner in Harland and Wolff, and he was victimised, and then he got a job as a full-time official with Amalgamated Society of Carpenters and Joiners, which is very prestigious. Very few Irish-based representatives, Irish-based trade unions got those full-time jobs in Britain. And as the Webbs, Sidney and Beatrice remind us, this is a time of the making of the sort of bureaucracy of British labour. So they had a big increase in full-time union officials from the 1890s in the wake of the new unionism. Because the craft unions could get by with, lay officials, because they were able to control entry into the trade, and that was their most important weapon. That was their way of maintaining a scarcity of labour, control entry into the trade. But the general unions couldn't do that. They needed full-time officials to hold them together. So you had a steady growth in the number of union officials in Britain from the 1890s up to 1914. And this generated a certain amount of tension and resentment in the rank and file, and what the Communist Party would later call rank and file tendencies. The Communists didn't like rank and file tendencies. But William Walker himself, although he was very much pro-British Labour, he was a Labour unionist really, in the sense that he believed that the answer to Irish Labour's problems was to unite within the British Labour movement. But he complained. He said it seemed to be almost a tenet of the amalgamatists that no Irishman need apply. So he was delighted naturally when he got a job as a full-time official with the Amalgamated Society of Carpenters and Joiners. But he set his sights on getting elected as an MP for Belfast North. Belfast was divided into 4 constituencies at the time, and the North was the most recently part of the city to be built, and was seen as the least sectarian and the most sort of labour-oriented part of the city. So Labour sort of set its sights on Belfast North. And I suppose you could be cynical and argue that if Walker was going to be elected an MP, he needed the British Labour Party, and it had to be Belfast North. So he persuaded Belfast Trades Council to abandon this local labourism, because their response to the increasing politicisation of labour in the 1890s was to form their own party, rather than affiliate with the TUC, which was seen to be too close to the Liberals. Form their own local Labour Party, but it proved very expensive and very difficult, very fractious to do that. So Walker persuaded them to affiliate instead to the British Labour Party, or the Labour Representation Committee as it was up to 1906, and to form a branch of that. But once he did that, he set Labour on collision course with the Unionists. It's been argued that James Connolly did that in 1911 when he came to Belfast. No. From 1903, once Belfast Trades Council affiliated to the British Labour Party, it was on collision course with the Unionists. And the Unionists, who had formerly been very friendly towards Belfast Trades Council, now turned quite hostile to it. And Walker kept protesting that he himself was personally a unionist, or pro-union at least, and that the best way to maintain the union was to join British parties. But the unionists said, no, you're just a home ruler, same as the rest of them. So there seems to be some tensions. There's some hints of tension between Baird and Walker, partly over the Belfast Labour Chronicle, which is a newspaper they brought out in 1904. And you could be forgiven for thinking that the primary purpose of this newspaper was to get William Walker into Westminster. So it gave very, very favourable coverage to Walker all the time. Some people on Belfast Trades Council resented, not so much for the content, but because of the way in which the Walkerites controlled it. And Baird does seem to have been one of those, so there seems to be a certain degree of friction between them. Sorry. So the Trades Council was very keen to get representatives from the shipyards onto the council, because arguably there were 2 labour movements in Belfast at this time. One which was sort of affiliated to the Trades Council and represented the smaller, weaker unions. A lot of unions in Belfast were locally based because, particularly when it came to the textile industries, the big amalgamated unions, as they were called, the British-based unions, didn't really organise those workers. So they tended to organise workers in the iron trades, engineering and shipbuilding. So the engineering and shipbuilding unions, basically for political reasons, were under-affiliated to Belfast Trades Council because they suspected the Trades Council to be too close to the Irish Trade Union Congress and to the Liberal Party. So here's just a kind of breakdown of the two characteristics of the two sets of unions. So right up until the 1930s, really, the unions in the shipyards had very little contact with the Irish Trade Union Congress. And they only started to affiliate in big numbers at that time because in the 1930s, you had a push to create an entirely Irish-based trade union movement. And it was really to kind of counter that the amalgamated started to affiliate more trade union members from the north to the ITAC. So this is just an indication of the economic fears of home. This is a postcard from the time showing Belfast in ruins under Home Rule. I think the economic argument was the second major argument against Home Rule. The first argument was that Home Rule would be Rome Rule. The second argument was that Home Rule would lead to the decline of Belfast industry, because the argument was that as soon as the Home Rulers got into power in Dublin, they would reintroduce tariffs. It was a kind of standard argument among nationalists that free trade with Britain, introduced after the Act of Union, was responsible for the decline of the Irish economy throughout the 19th century. And that the way to rebuild the Irish economy was to impose tariffs, which is what Fianna Fáil did in 1932, and build up the economy behind the tariff wall. And the argument in Belfast was that Belfast was very dependent on trade with Britain, and these tariffs would have a ruinous effect on the economy. So here we see a somewhat humorous postcard with a statue of John, I think it's John Redmond and Joe Devlin, the MP, Nationalist MP for Belfast West, and cattle and sheep grown in front of the City Hall. So the unions are very proud of the City Hall, which had been completed in 1906, and it is the finest City Hall in Ireland. Although famously it was described when it was built as a wedding cake at a pauper's funeral. This is saying the same thing, but it's given a more kind of sectarian, explicit sectarian twist to it. Again, the statue of John Redmond has been wheeled in. There you see Protestant emigration office. And so, you know, the implications, the Protestants will have to emigrate to make way for Catholic jobs after Home Rule. But that was a strong argument, you know, that was current at the time. So it does indicate the importance of the labour question and the economic question in the debate on Home Rule. So in politics, again, we don't know much about Baird's early politics, except that he does say that he was a socialist and a Home Ruler since 1893. He was a Boilermakers delegate to the founding of the Belfast Labour Representation Committee in 1903. It took place in what was called Ye Old Castle Restaurant in the centre of Belfast, and it was a sort of a gala occasion. And at the time, the Labour Representation Committee had only 2 MPs, and they had high hopes that William Walker would win Belfast North. So it was a big deal that Walker would do that. So you had Ramsay MacDonald and Keir Hardy as frequent visitors to Belfast, speaking in support of Walker. And they were challenged, of course, on the Home Rule question. And they said, oh, Labour has no official position on Home Rule. Though in practice they were all very sympathetic to Home Rule. But they said, we've no official position on Home Rule, and our MPs are free to make up their own mind on the constitutional question. So they said Walker can vote any way he wants on a Home Rule question. But Baird does seem to be very interested in politics. He makes a number of attempts to be elected as a Boilermakers delegate to the annual conferences of the British Labour Party. And then later on, he joins the Independent Labour Party. So this is just an indication, a sort of a rough sort of outline of Belfast Labour politics. The Belfast Labour sort of tried to go it alone to avoid taking a stand on the constitutional question. They tried to go it alone and create, in fact, their own Labour Party when they put up 6 candidates for election to Belfast Corporation in 1896, all supported, sponsored by the Trades Council, all were elected. But as I say, it proved to be difficult and expensive to maintain this local Labour Party, so they go for British Labour. But by 1912, it seemed as if Home Rule was inevitable. So what do you do about that? The answer of the Walker rights really is to just keep trying to postpone the question as long as you can. And but I think that when it came to the crunch, they didn't like Home Rule, but they hated partition more than they hated Home Rule. So I think they would have gone with Home Rule in the final analysis. This William Walker himself, he had sort of abandoned hope of being elected in Belfast North after 1906. He narrowly lost the 1906 general election, in 1906 general election, and then he tried to get a seat in Britain, and he got this nomination for Leith Boroughs. It was a sort of it was a no-hope seat for Labour, but he got the nomination anyway. And then in 1911, he took a job with the new national insurance scheme introduced by the Liberal government. It's one of the kind of great achievements of the new liberalism, which was designed to try and head off programme of social welfare reforms designed to try and head off the challenge from the Labour Party. And Walker got a job as a government inspector, as quite a number of Labour activists did. So this is just Walker's election result. But the second Home Rule crisis, the third Home Rule crisis in 1912, had a disastrous effect on the Labour Party, particularly after the 1910 general election, when you had 2 general elections in 1910, and both of them returned a hung parliament. But the Liberals were put back into power with the support of the Irish Nationalist MPs and the Labour Party MPs. And this was an absolute disaster for Labour in Belfast, because it so obviously tied up Labour with Home Rule and the Liberals. And it became very difficult for Labour to articulate a position politically, or even for Belfast Trades Council to operate effectively, because it was so very much identified now with Labour and with Home Rule. But in 1912, you had another wave of expulsions, as you had in the shipyards. The shipyard men regarded themselves as the shock troops of loyalism. And there was always an excuse cited for these expulsions. But, you know, in Northern Ireland, or the 6 counties, Ulster, whatever it was before 1921, there's always an excuse to be found. You know, Demon started it, and then this becomes the rationale for attacking workers in the shipyards. But in reality, Catholics in the shipyards were regarded as political hostages. So whenever there was a serious crisis, loyalists felt entitled to kick them out. What was different about 1912 was that you had a number of Protestants expelled as well. There were about 3,000 workers expelled, and about 600 were Protestants. And they were expelled because they were known to be Labour activists, or they were associated with the Liberal Party, or in some cases they were Sloanites, identified with Todd Sloan and his independent Orange Order. So Baird was a union delegate to RSC Commissioner T.J. Smith. He was Commissioner for the City of Belfast for the police, and he sought protection for Catholic workers. Titanic. If only he'd written something on the Titanic, the book would sell millions. That's so frustrating. His granddaughter says that he worked on the Titanic, but I mean, she knew him when she was 4 or 5, and he was quite elderly by that stage and suffering from poor health in the 1940s. So we don't know that he did write anything on the Titanic or had any kind of recollections about it. But it's a great pity, great opportunity missed. He really comes to prominence in the summer of 1918, when you had the shorter hours movement developing within the metal trades. And there's a big meeting organised in the Ulster Hall campaign for a shorter hours movement. By the end of August, it's starting to look as if the Germans are going to lose the war, although they thought it would drag on maybe for another year. But definitely by the late August of 1918, it looks as if the war is going to end within about 12 months anyway, and Germany's going to lose. So they kind of agreed to kind of postpone pressing for shorter hours, or pressing for an agreement in shorter hours at that stage. But things did come to a head then in January of 1919 with the 44-hour strike movement. And this was in effect Belfast workers going on a solo run along with workers in Glasgow, and setting the pace, whereas the unions wanted to compromise on the issue. The workers and agreed to 47 hours. The working week in the shipyards at the time was about 54 hours. But the unions wanted to strike for 44 hours. So Baird was certainly very much involved with that strike, and the strike was led by what was called the General Strike Committee, which used to meet in Garfield Street in the centre of Belfast. And there were up to about 120 people on the committee, and they organised all sorts of things: entertainments, the regulation of emergency supplies, they controlled transport and water. So some journalists refer to it as the Belfast Soviet, because they in effect did kind of take over the running of the city up to a point. But the national question again kind of intruded on that, because there were offers of help from the Irish TUC and from the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. And they had problems about accepting these. They rejected any assistance from the ITGW. They said there are 5 transport unions in Belfast. If we take help from the ITGW, we'll have problems with the other 4. And there were long debates about whether they should take any help from the ITUC. Another kind of curiosity about the strike committee is that, normally in a strike, what a strike committee will do is sort of play up the leaders of the strike to give workers leaders that they can identify with. But it was the opposite in Belfast, that the strike committee deliberately tried to play down the leadership, because they knew that individuals would be targeted, and their religious background or their political background would be highlighted and exploited for political purposes by the unionists or by the employers. So the editor of the Belfast, or the Northern Whig, he spotted this tendency, and he says, these people are very cute at keeping a low profile and not letting people know who they are and what their background is. But Baird is willing to come forward and write some articles about the aims of the strike and aims of the labour movement at the time. And Austin Morgan, he wrote a very kind of thorough book on Belfast labour, 1905 to 1923. He argues that Baird was on the strike committee, but was expelled from it early on because he was seen as too militant, too radical. And Baird certainly turned against. The strike was a kind of turning point for him, in that he turned against the leaders of the unions involved in the strike and felt that they'd let down the workers. And he also became very much enamoured of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. He felt this was a more fighting union, and they had a vision for the future, because they were much more influenced by syndicalism and the idea of one big union. And he argued strongly for this idea of getting all workers in one big union, which is an unusual thing to do. I mean, for given that he was a craftsman, he'd been sort of trained in the Boilermakers Union, which is very much a trade union for tradesmen, and deliberately kept out unskilled workers. And now Baird is rejecting all of that. He's saying, no, we need to get everybody, irrespective of grade, into the one union and working together on a class basis. So he makes that clear, and he starts to engage with the Transport Union newspaper, The Voice of Labour, which again kind of would have been seen as a kind of socialist Republican paper, edited by Cathal O'Shannon, who was very much kind of an outspoken socialist Republican at this time, and would have kind of distanced him also from the massive workers in Belfast. But he was elected to the corporation in 1920 when you had a big Labour contingent elected. The elections were held on proportional representation, which the British government introduced because they didn't want another, kind of ironically, they didn't want another repeat of the Sinn Féin landslide in 1918. Sinn Féin got 45% of the vote in 1918, though that was partly because a lot of seats went uncontested. So they would have got more votes if they'd contested, if there had been more contests. But with about 45% of the vote, they got about 70% of the seats. So Britain thought, well, with PR, we could prevent that happening again. So they introduced PR, though the unionists opposed it. And there were 60 seats in Belfast Corporation. You can see there, the unionists won 29, though the Ulster Unionist Labour Association, which is really just the Labour wing of the Unionist Party, they won 6. Then you had 2 independent unionists. But the official Belfast Labour Party won 10 seats. And then there were also 2 independent Labour who were, candidates from the shipyards. So Labour becomes the main opposition on Belfast Corporation. And you can see there the affiliations. All of the candidates had trade union connections. Many of them would have been full-time officials in the unions and strong connections with the ILP, the Independent Labour Party, or Belfast Trades Council. They had varying positions on the national question. They weren't united on that question at all. The shipyard expulsions then began 21st of July. So the numbers affected by the expulsions are very difficult to quantify. At least 8,140. They're actually known to be, their names were collected and they're known to have been expelled. And of these, about a quarter were Protestants. So again, a very high proportion of Protestants. And these would have been targeted because they were Labour activists. So, I mean, if you take 2,000 activists out of a movement in a city the size of Belfast, you're doing a lot of damage to that movement. So thousands of others left work of their own volition. Now, the question is, was it combustion or conspiracy? The standard view is that it was a response, spontaneous response to the assassination of RIC Commander Gerald Smith in Cork on the 17th of July. There's always an excuse. Not difficult in the north, to pick these excuses. Unions have been talking about this certainly since the municipal elections. And 2 newspapers, the Irish Times and the Westminster Gazette, which would have been, it was a London newspaper, it's pro-Liberal Party. They were ridiculing this. The Gazette in particular was ridiculing this idea that his response to the assassination of Commander Smith. And they were saying, look, everybody knew this was coming. The police knew it was coming. It's only a question of when. And you had a growth in the number of loyalist associations. Probably the most important was the Ulster Unionist Labour Association. In 1918, Carson in particular, they were all afraid of the swing to the left that was expected after World War I, and afraid of the impact of the Bolshevik Revolution in the west of Europe. There was also a feeling that there had to be some payback to Labour for the assistance that organised Labour gave for the prosecution of the war, which after all was an industrial war. So everybody was expecting this swing to the left. And Carson thought, we need a specific appeal to workers within the Unionist Party. So you had a trade union kind of version of that called the Ulster Workers' Union, formed by a man called Torkington. Then you had other groups like the British Empire Union, founded in 1916 as the Anti-German Union, 5,000 members in Belfast, and they were quite well organised and able to lobby. Carson was an honorary president. At the end of the war, they kind of turned the venom from Germans to Bolsheviks, and Jews were also targeted. the Ulster Ex-Servicemen's Association, the Belfast Protestant Association, which ostensibly was the agency behind the expulsions, though whether it was just a cover name used by other groups is open to question. And then later on, Robert Boyd and Councillor Twaddell, who was assassinated in Belfast, they formed the Ulster Imperial Guards. Now, looking at the response of the trade unions, sorry, I'm running kind of way over time here, I think. Briefly, the response of the trade unions, it reflected the divisions on the expulsions. So unions were very slow to take action. If they did take action, they wanted it to be discreet. They're aware that some of their members were not, to be more sympathetic to the loyalists in Belfast than to the expellees. And Baird and also John Hanna, who was another Boilermaker Presbyterian, he was from Belfast. He led the expelled workers representation committee, and they appealed to the TUCs both in Britain and in Ireland. This is just a poster from the time. What's interesting is that the expellees and the nationalists saw the expulsions as an attack, as an attempt to try and thwart the labour movement. They felt that Labour was moving anti-unionist, and that the expulsions were a response to the success of Labour in the 1920 elections. I'm not saying that view is correct. You could argue about it, but it's interesting that that view is quite very commonly held. And Baird became a bit notorious in Belfast, particularly for a speech he made to the TUC in September 1921, where he said, place an economic boycott in Belfast. He said, put a barbed wire fence around Belfast until, they allowed the expelled workers back to their jobs and so on. But I don't think it's personally bitter. There was a letter from when he was employed as an organizer by the ITGW in Waterford in 1922, in which he sends a letter to a friend in Belfast, and he says, poor Twaddell, he was gunned down by the IRA as he exited Garfield Street. Poor Twaddell did not make much out of his twisting and no popery, which he did not believe in. And then he goes on, I'm still of the opinion that political honesty is best, at least I'm yet alive, which is something. He had a casual attitude towards punctuation in his letters, although his spelling was quite good. That was in June 1922. Interestingly, that letter, a typed copy of that letter, was sent to the new Northern Ministry of Labour as an example of how Labour was in league with extremists and furnished for ammunition against Labour. The TUC did respond in sending a delegation to Belfast and came up with a report which basically whitewashed the loyalists. That, more or less took their side, and didn't really show any sympathy for didn't show much sympathy, at least. Certainly didn't propose to take any action to help the expelled workers. They got a lot of sympathy, but not much else, from the Irish TUC. And Tom Johnson, who was a man who had an absolute horror of any kind of confrontation, he said, look, there's not much we can do here. This is a photograph. This is Greenspun here on the left. He was Jewish, born in Dublin, but of Russian origin, and there are a number of references to him in correspondence at the time. They always call him the Russian Jew, indicating there was kind of latent anti-Semitism around. And this is John Hanna then seated at the TUC in Cardiff. So the Irish TUC again did very little, really. The nationalist response was very, very clumsy. They imposed this boycott on Belfast goods, which did more harm than good in many ways. And in some ways, it was, open to sectarian abuse in the south of Ireland. Baird tried to canvass support, particularly among Protestants in Dublin. They actually visited the provost of Trinity College and the new Church of Ireland Archbishop of Dublin. Both of them very reluctant to help. This attitude seems to be that Catholics have brought this on themselves. They stood in the 1920 won elections, the first elections to the Stormont Parliament, found it very difficult to canvass because the atmosphere at the time was so hostile. And just to make a long story short, Baird takes up a job in 1922 as an organiser with the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, operating in the southeast of Ireland. But the union is in decline. They're letting organisers go. And 1924, by the middle of 1924, he's back in Belfast. Was he sacked? Did he leave? We don't know. But it's probably likely that they let him go because the union was cutting back on spending and membership was falling rapidly. So he goes back to Belfast in 1924. Obviously, things are very difficult for him. 1927, the whole family moves to Brisbane, Australia, except Nora, who has a piano teaching practice in Belfast, and she stays on. But obviously, there are close families because within a few months, she joins the rest of them. And herself and her sister, Helene, teach piano in schools around Queensland. And Nora gets the MBE for this. This is Nora, Buckingham Palace, 1964, I think, getting an MBE. And her sister gets the Order of Australian Merit. So they're both noted in the press for that. This is the mother. When it's interesting that in the comments on the progress of Nora and Helene, you know, in teaching the piano and all that, they make no reference to their father at all, no connection to James Baird. So we can see Francis there, who died in the 1955, I think it was. So just some final points. Baird was exceptional. In terms of, you know, the northern Protestant working class, but he was typical, I think, of the Labour activists, though again a bit unusual in that he went as far as he did in associating ultimately with republicanism and then working for the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. But he was. He also indicates that the TUCs in both Britain and Ireland really didn't want to know about Belfast, didn't want to get involved, and the British TUC was afraid of losing members. For the Irish TUC, we're sympathetic, but it's trouble, and we really don't want to know about it. Okay, thank you very much for all of that, and I hope it gives you some indication of Baird and his life. Thanks.
Thanks so much. So we have people here and we have people online. So I'll start with people here and see if there are people online. We'll check in a bit. You're happy to take questions?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So thank you so much for that.
You're very welcome.
And would anybody like to ask a question? Eamon Hughes.
Hi, thanks for that. Well, I know you said very little known about his early life, but you know, you showed him becoming an apprentice aged about 21 or 22, which seems to me to be old for an apprentice at that point. So, do you know anything about why he was delayed so long taking up an apprenticeship, or you know,
yeah, yeah, he does seem to have been a bit old. And I think he kind of falsified his age because when he was formally admitted to the union, when he was out of his time, I think he gave his age as he gave his age as 22, I think. In fact, he would have been 4 or 5 years older. Yeah. So it's possible that he lied about his age to get in, and it's possible that because of the rapid expansion of marine engineering in Belfast in the 1890s, that they were taking in people without asking too many questions about their background.
Sean Conley.
Yeah, I mean, you explained, you know, why he becomes a strong anti-partitionist.
Yeah.
Because of he believed in institutionalized sectarianism.
Yeah.
But is there any indication, how did he feel when nationalism develops as a physical force movement We've got the IRA kind of thing about.
Yeah.
Does there any qualms about that? Does it support it?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't know. I mean, I mentioned there the letter to about Twaddell, and that was sent to Danny McDevitt, who would have been kind of, again, from a Labour background, but had become a kind of Republican activist by 1920-21. We also know that Baird was on a delegation to meet De Valera in, I think it was late 1921, where he urges him to stand firm on not to accept partition. So he does seem to kind of turn a blind eye to the independence struggle and to variations of it. And for him, the sort of bottom line was, you've got to fight on. Don't accept partition under any circumstances. The one kind of reservation he does express about it is in a letter to a friend of his in the Irish Self-Determination League, which he's talking about. It's just after the McMahon murders in Belfast, and he's saying, I'm very rattled by these murders. And he says, it's always the way, people in the South, they shoot landlords and they don't think about the effect that this has on Catholics in Belfast. And people in the South don't really understand what's going on here and don't really care about the consequences of what they do.
Graham Walker.
I was just thinking about other Labour activists at the time, like William McMullen, Sam Kyle. They both got jobs in the trade union movement in the South as well as Baird. Obviously stands for election 21 with Midgley. But there is a sense that he seems a bit of a loner. He doesn't seem connected with these big Labour figures of the 1920s. Is that right?
James Baird?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's very much just like a branch secretary up to about 1918. There's an amazing kind of continuity of service there, because he's a branch secretary about 1901. But he kind of suddenly appears into the limelight, as it were, in the summer of 1918 as a leader of the Shorter Hours movement. He's one of about 5 or 6 people in Harlan Wolff who's organising this shop floor movement called the Shorter Hours movement. And the newsletter wonders who he is and suggests he might be a Scotsman. So that would indicate that they don't know much about his background. So it's later due to his work with the expelled workers that he meets kind of leading personalities. And with the Transport Union, he meets the leaders of the Irish Self-Determination League. He speaks around England for them. He meets leaders of the TUC. He meets De Valera. Later on, 1923, he meets Jim Larkin. So he does meet these top people, and he's sort of seen. But he's seen in terms of his stature. He's seen as an organizer. He's not sort of up there on the same par as Larkin or Connolly or whatever. He's not as known for any kind of theoretical articulation. He hasn't acquired a big reputation in that respect, or even as a leader. But he's seen the comments on him from the Irish Self-Determination League suggest that they describe him as a fluent speaker and well able for heckling. So they seem to be, impressed with him as a public speaker.
I think part of what Graham said maybe answered part of my question, but I'm wondering what happened to that kind of layer of trade union activists who come out of the 1919 strike and then are active around 1920 and get a decent return on the elections, 1920 elections. What happens to them after, the expulsions, the next round of expulsions, and then partition? Do they? I think Graham, you just said St. Carl heads south, and Baird seems to head south as well, right? So, is it that Belfast becomes too hot for them to stick around? Because they seem to have had, if you judge by the election returns, they had some influence at one point, and then within 4 or 5 years that's gone, and there doesn't seem to be any space for a kind of a radical Protestant Labour tradition in in the new Northern state. So, does Baird's life tell us anything about that? Just a quick aside, I think Antoinette, I think Sean Mitchell presents some pretty strong circumstantial evidence that Tommy Guillen, who led the 32 ODR riots, was one of the people involved in Tordell's assassination, possibly. But you may know more about that. But my main question really is about what happens after 1920.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, because people, usually when people say that's a very good question, that means they don't know the answer. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think there was a sort of a scattering, and Belfast did become too hot for them. Now we know that Dennis Houston, who's a transport union man, and he's a councillor in Belfast Corporation, he was sent to Scotland by the ATGW to sort of, look after the interests of workers who'd gone from Belfast to Scotland. So obviously, quite a number did go there, and with the possibilities of work in shipyards in Scotland, that would be an obvious place to go. So you also have, there's a meeting of the Irish Engineering Union, Irish Engineering and Foundry Union, which is discussing the response to events in Belfast, and they're talking about workers moving to Dublin, and they've got kind of mixed feelings on it, because some are saying, well, we have our own troubles down here, we don't want more shipyard men coming down to Dublin in 1921, so on. So I think
your sense of unions trying to help people relocate.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I think there is a kind of scattering, and the general pattern after these expulsions that very, very few of the workers get their jobs back. Some do, but very, very few.
We want the job.
Yeah. So, I mean, and it also involved things like, losing tools, and your tool set might cost you about £5. And Baird raises this point. He says, well, if you won't allow the workers back, will you at least allow them or the police or somebody to go back and get their tools? That kind of thing. So, but politically, there's a very rapid change between January 1920 and May of 1921, when you get the Stormont elections, because it's almost impossible for Baird and Hannah and Midgley to campaign in Belfast and Maitland, and everybody is sort of surprised. The Unionists put up 16 candidates in Belfast, and 15 are elected, and the Unionists themselves were quite surprised at this. Everybody's surprised how badly Labour does in the elections. So, there is this sort of sudden sort of transformation. Labour regroups in 1924 and forms the Northern Ireland Labour Party then, and they sort of get going again, but on a different basis really. To some extent, they've kind of learnt the lesson, and their foreign position in 24, they won't take a position on partition. They leave members to hold their own position on partition.
Just something. My name is Francis Higgins. Just something to note. I'm ex-Boilermaker shop steward in Harnwood. I had a red letter, which you would class as a black score.
You were what?
So you class as a black score.
He was a red letter.
I was a red letter. So essentially, when it comes to the black score, they got the worst job. They might have been a Boilermaker, but the good jobs were the guys in the shops, because they would have had clean jobs. Black score were the guys who had been sent down to ship repair. If ship come in and had to have its entrails ripped out, that was a black score. It was the jobs that nobody wanted.
Yeah.
And that's why Catholics were sent to work in the black score.
But it would have been a well-paid job, though, wouldn't it?
You would have
or potentially
more hours overtime. Certainly, they would have had unlimited.
Were they on piecework?
They were, yes.
Yeah. See, you could earn a lot of money though.
But it was filthy. And have you ever seen photographs of the black squad?
Yeah.
To see when nobody wanted to work.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I mean, one of the things that intrigues me about Baird is that he's moving up the ladder steadily. If you look at his addresses, those are the days when if you had a decent job, you could afford a decent house, unlike today. But he's moving up the ladder steadily in terms of the houses that he has in Belfast. And, by 1918, he sort of reached the peak, and that he's got a nice little villa in the east of the city. with a room where his daughters teach the piano and so on. So I get the impression he was earning good money, even though maybe it was a dirty job. But that becomes, he was called Dongaree Baird because he turned up for a meeting of the corporation wearing his dungarees, and the newsletter in particular took great exception to this. He's wearing his filthy dungarees with his cap stuck into his pocket, and he turns up for the corporation like this. So yeah, well, yeah. I mean, in terms of skilled manual workers, who would be at the very top?
Skilled manual.
Skilled manual, yeah.
It would be the platers,
right.
Platers and steel workers. The boilermakers would come well up there.
Yeah.
Then you would have carpenters.
Baird was a caulker.
He's a caulker as well.
Yeah, yeah.
See, that would have meant he would have been working on the outside of the ship.
Yeah.
You know, it was the same when I worked there.
Yeah.
So the guys did all the best jobs were the guys who worked in the shops because it was warm. During the summer, they could open the doors. It was reasonably clean.
Yeah.
As you worked on the ship, then you were down in the bowels of the ship, especially if he was in the black squad.
Yeah.
He would have been on the decks on his hands and knees, driving in, caulking with a hammer.
Yeah.
In between the planks.
Yeah.
It's great work, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're making money on it.
Yeah.
But it was a limited time you could do that.
Right.
You know, he would have been looking for a way to get away from the tools, because when you come to a certain age, you couldn't do it. You couldn't retire.
Yeah.
As in the black squad, you know.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's me talking about.
No, that's very interesting, because I mean, a lot of the reports on labour, the Royal Commissions on Labour, they talk about the work involved with the shipyard men and so on, and they say, well, yeah, these people are earning good money, but they've got, their work is chronically unstable, in that they've got these phases of unemployment, and also that it can be very dirty work, and then it can be dangerous work. I think about 18 people died when they were building the Titanic. 18 people died in Harland Wolff in industrial accidents. Not all of them working on the Titanic, but during the time that they were building the ship. And a lot of the workers doing work like Baird, I mean, they suffered from deafness problems because the hammering, or blindness, or well, they became visually impaired. But they daren't wear glasses, because if they were wearing glasses, they might not retain their employment. And Baird spent his final years in an oxygen tent in Brisbane.
Because of his lungs.
Yeah.
Can I ask, did he have continuous employment in Harland, or was it?
Yeah. I mean, from what I understand, I don't know if he was laid off from time to time, but he was continuously secretary of the Boilermakers Union. They had, I think, about 9 or 10 branches in Belfast. He was secretary of the branch in East Belfast. But whether he did suffer bouts of unemployment, I don't know. But it was common enough for workers.
You used to have the meat market.
Yeah.
Now, it happened when I was there.
Yeah.
But you were employed.
Yeah.
Essentially, everybody stood, and the best jobs were you got you need a foreman, or you got the best job, okay?
Yeah.
And so all the best jobs were handled first. It came down the line, the pecking order. Then it was called a meat market.
Right.
But it was the same right up until the 1950s, where you would have stood at the gates, and the foreman would have went out. And it would have been a black squad, because those were the ones who would have had seasonal work.
Yeah.
Maybe 3 ship repair boats come in. So they would have went out, and would have people whose faces fitted, as the term was used. If your face fitted, you got the job for a week or 2 weeks, or how long the ship was in, then you're laid off. And so trade unionists were a distinct disadvantage, because they were the educators.
Yeah, yeah.
So it would have been, I haven't read your book about the book, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. But it would have been a really tough thing for this man, because he was going against everything, every grain there is in Belfast.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to reading it.
Well, I hope you enjoyed it.
Do we have anybody trying to ask questions here? I don't think so.
Have anyone?
Online, I'm just trying to see.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Do I have anyone?
Yeah. So
Sorry. What do we know about his education and that of his children? This is from Alice Johnson.
Yeah, we don't know very much about his education. From his letters, his letters are well composed. The spelling is very good, but I'd say he had a kind of casual attitude towards punctuation. But I reckon his education didn't go beyond the primary level. As to his daughters, the two eldest became very distinguished pianists, and the eldest daughter Nora was passing her exams, the London Academy of Music, throughout the height of Baird's political work and trade union work in Belfast. And this is noted occasionally in the Belfast newspapers, but there's no reference to her family or father or anything like that. They simply note that she's passed an exam and is very well thought of by our pupils in Belfast and so forth.
So I think I'm obliged to state that we are all being recorded and transcribed. I haven't actually stated. It's been stated. Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
You talked about a member of the family getting in touch with you when you were had the book in press. She's a daughter's daughter, yeah?
Yes.
Was there any more information on the mother's family? And in terms of, is that a way you could follow it up through his wife's father, the RIC constable?
Yeah. He was head constable. Yeah.
Well, head constable is.
He retired as head constable in the Yard. I think it's more or less
moderately elevated position.
Yeah, it's more or less equivalent to sergeant, isn't it?
Yeah, at least I would think.
Yeah.
So where was he? Where was he stationed, or where was he based?
Well, I think he was stationed in Tipperary at some point. He then, I think, at the time Baird got married, he was stationed in Antrim.
Possibly follow it up.
He retired to run a small farm around Lisburn.
Oh, did he?
Mm.
It's quite interesting.
Mm.
Do we know what happened to the farm?
I don't know what happened to the farm. I was looking for years to try and make contact with his people in Australia and getting nowhere. And then eventually at the last minute, as I say, I got through the school that Nora attended. And the school, it's the University of Queensland. They offer, their musical conservatory offers a scholarship in her name, the Mary Baird Scholarship. So they put me in touch with the family, and I was able to speak then to Baird's granddaughter, Victoria.
Could you talk to them again? Do you think they've more stuff?
What?
Do you think they've more stuff?
Well, I'm going to see them in Brisbane next month, so I hopefully will make.
Peter, Greg.
So I'm still interested in how Presbyterian small farmers son becomes a Belfast socialist activist. I'm wondering, is there potentially a kind of connection with Russellism? Very much from South Tyrol is Russell's constituency. Obviously, it embodies this tradition of radical liberal unionism, which is agrarianist rather than socialist, but nevertheless utilises the language of class conflict.
Yeah.
At times leads ultimately obviously to a rift with official unionism and actually rejoining the Liberals. So is there any evidence of kind of Russellism or any connection with Russell in Baird's biography?
Yes, in a vague sort of way, in that he certainly is interested in the agrarian question to some extent. Yeah, and that kind of relates to his own background, I think. Growing up, tenant farmer. There was also a Labour and socialist agitator at the time called Reverend John Bruce Wallace, who was he was active in Belfast. He hoped to create he became eventually, he started off as a Presbyterian minister, then moved to Congregationalism, and he then moved to Christian anarchism and did a tour of Christian anarchist cooperatives and utopian communes in Mexico, United States, and Canada, and then moved back to Ireland and wanted to set up one of these anarchist communes in Limavady. Didn't last very long. Call it the Circle Cooperative Society, because the idea was that it would be the centre of a network of related communes. But he after that he moved back to Belfast, and he did address shipyard workers on at least 3 occasions about the virtues of Christian socialism and so on. On the last occasion, he was very narrowly he narrowly avoided being thrown in the river. He was rescued by what were referred to as some of the senior and more moderate members or workers. But he also stood in the 1921 elections in Belfast. In total, there were 5 socialist candidates. There was a man called Adams in North Down. There was Baird, Hannah, Midgley, and Reverend John Bruce Wallace stood as well. But none of them did very well in terms of winning votes. But Baird had some articles in the Voice of Labour, 1918, where he does talk about the future society and problems of organising food production and so on. He indicates some interest in the agrarian question there. Yeah. And his son was very interested in becoming a farmer as well.
Isn't it it's a farm labour strike that was involved in Waterford too.
That's right, yeah. And ironically, one of the things thrown against him by the employers, by the farmers, is that he's a Belfast shipyard worker, so what would he know about farms? So they cite that against him. Yeah. But he was, in fact, in practice, he was more or less the leader of the farm workers in the big farm strike in Waterford, which started in May 1923 and ended in collapse in December of 1923.
If we want to buy the book, we don't have any special value way of getting it from UCT Press, do we?
I don't know if they offer a discount or whatever.
Well, we can apply directly to them if we wish to buy it. Anyway.
Yeah, they probably have it here and no alibis.
No alibis. You
no
should
alibis,
have. Yeah. So do you think there are copies there at the moment?
I think so. Yeah.
So copies available now. Yeah. Should have done a promotion. I can't see any more questions. Yeah. We certainly a fascinating individual, and so thank you so much for a really interesting paper. I think we all greatly enjoyed. So thanks so very much, Emmet.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Graham.